A lot of the books that we've been using, a lot of the pieces of literature that we've been using in our summer series are ones that are probably well known. If you go back through, we've hit a number of books and a number of pieces of great literature that a lot of people are aware of. Maybe you've read many of them. Today's work that we're going to use is one that may not be so familiar with you, but maybe it is. It's a work that came out in this last century, and it's called The Fountainhead. And it is a story of a man named Howard Rourke, who is a young, ambitious architect. And Howard Rourke is someone who comes into this, following his schooling, has a vision and has a grand design for what he wants to do with his career, with his vocation, and with his life. Howard Rourke is the protagonist. He's the champion of a novel written by Ayn Rand that talks about what it's like to encounter opposition. Now, we could have used a lot of different works to talk about this, but I thought that the parallels between Howard Rourke's life and Nehemiah's life were interesting. See, Howard Rourke was in the book, he is an architect who's trying to accomplish something great. He's trying to bring a new style into the architectural world. In Nehemiah's life, he is trying to accomplish something great. He's trying to rebuild the walls around Jerusalem. Howard Rourke, through this story, finds himself beset or surrounded by people who are trying to oppose him. People who play off as though they're friends. People who play off as though they're interested in him. People who play off as though they have his best interests at heart. In fact, they don't. They go about a scheme to privately or publicly oppose him. Nehemiah, as we're going to see, has many people that are similar in his life. People that go around and oppose him and oppose what he's about and oppose that vision that he has. But also, Howard Rourke comes, and not only is he similar to Nehemiah in how he is building something, how he has this grand vision as opposed, but he also comes from a far land to lead a great work, just like Nehemiah. In the story, if you're familiar with it in the Fountainhead, Howard comes and he's going about his work, and he has a number of relationships that go on about it. People that come into his life, people that try to use him, try to manipulate him. Some people that stand against him. Some of the people that oppose him do so because they want to make more money off of him. Some people oppose him because they philosophically disagree that buildings should look the way that he believes buildings should look. They want to maintain the status quo. Never forget that opposition oftentimes is rooted in people who want to maintain the status quo, because life is a whole lot better when it's comfortable for some people. But you'll never grow if you don't try to pull those things apart. You don't stretch yourself. No God-accomplished vision ever comes about by being comfortable. Just remember that. But we also see in the Fountainhead that there are people who align themselves with Rourke, but ultimately try to use his ideas and his innovations and his ways to gain their own standing. Opposition comes at Rourke from a number of different angles, and that we see that he ultimately is betrayed in many ways. But he stands on his principles. He stands on that thing, that vision, that clear vision. Now, Rourke goes about his task in a way that's a little bit different than Nehemiah, but it's nonetheless, it's compelling. How are you doing with opposition? In the earlier service during one of our prayer times, we asked the question, have you ever been opposed? Have you ever had somebody that's opposed you on something? I think all of us can say that's probably true. Kyle can probably give us a long litany of stories of people or teenagers who are built to oppose things. But there's faithfulness in the midst of that. Have you ever seen opposition in your life, maybe where you live, work, and play? Now, let's not be confused. Not all opposition is the same. Now, conflict is not necessarily opposition. Conflict is not necessarily opposition. Because we encounter conflict often. I mean, just any given day, you're going to encounter conflict. Conflict comes into our lives for a lot of different reasons. I was talking to my wife, Kat, about this the other day. I think everybody should be required to take a personality class before they leave high school, because by that point, you're pretty set. Now, you can use whatever matrix you want to, Myers-Briggs or DISC or any of the other ones that you want to use. But ultimately, what that teaches you is that everybody's different. The ones that we've got to be worried about are the ones that think that everybody is the same. Or they're really the ones that we really should worry about are the people that think everyone should be like them. So that's a dangerous issue. That's where ego comes in, by the way. But the challenge there is that I think most conflict is based ultimately in personality clashes, maybe just different views on some things. Conflict does not equal opposition. Conflict does not equal opposition. One of my favorite books that I can read for business, one that I recommend to organizations, churches, not-for-profits that I work with, is one by a guy named Patrick Lencioni called, just went out of my head, The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. And in The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, it's sort of a leadership fable. It's really well written. Patrick Lencioni talks about how one of the most scary things that he encounters in organizations are conflict-less organizations, or organizations where healthy conflict doesn't exist. These are organizations where people maybe are just trying to get by throughout the day, or maybe there's just a lot of sycophants, people that want to be yes people, that the leader wants people that walk like them, talk like them, act like them, do everything like them. It doesn't create a system where there's a good give and take. Lencioni reminds us that healthy conflict is the root of successful organizations. But conflict in and of itself isn't opposition. Conflict isn't inherently bad. Now, opposition, though, is indeed bad. Opposition is certainly bad. It is something that is very different from conflict. Opposition occurs where a group of people or someone stands against a vision, a purpose, or they attempt to thwart your plans. They come against you specifically to come against you, and they sort of hang around. Opposition's difficult. Opposition hurts. Opposition can come from a lot of different angles. And as we're going to see with Nehemiah today, opposition happens to all of us, and it certainly happens to Nehemiah. Nehemiah encountered opposition to his plans. If you want to, we're going to be in Nehemiah chapter 4. We're going to be picking up. This is in the midst of the Bible. There's a couple, if you're interested, you didn't bring one with you or don't have one on your phone, there's a pew Bible in the back of the pew in front of you, and you can certainly turn to that. We're going to be on page 344. Also, if you get in the middle and you find Psalms, start heading backwards. You're going to find Job, or Job, Nehemiah, and then Esther. If you hit Ezra, you've gone a little too far. But Nehemiah chapter 4 is where we're going to be. This is picking up the story that we've had. We find ourselves in the midst of stories. It's always interesting. I was talking to a friend of mine who's in ministry a couple of weeks ago, and I was talking about the differences in churches and how different churches do different things, and it's okay. That one of the things that a lot of churches do is during the summer they do a sermon series based around the movies that have come out. And I said, we at University Baptist Church do a sermon series around great works of literature. So it's a little bit different approach, and it's perfect for our church in so many ways. But in Nehemiah chapter 4, we've been in the midst of a series talking about how do we build things, looking at Nehemiah's life, what leadership principles and personal principles can we gain from it. And we find him in verse 1, after having seen so many successes with the building of the wall and sealing of that up, that Nehemiah finds himself confronted with opposition. Let's look and see what it looks like. And when Sanballat heard that they were rebuilding the wall, he became furious. He mocked the Jews before his colleagues and the powerful men of Samaria. And he said, "What are these pathetic Jews doing? Can they restore it, that is the wall, by themselves? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they ever finish it? Can they bring these burnt stones back to life from the mounds of rubble?" Every one of his questions there is posed rhetorically to give a negative answer. That's something that you'll want to pay attention to. And we're going to kick up with Tobiah. Tobiah the Ammonite in verse 3, who was beside him, said, "Indeed, even if a fox climbed up on what they are building, he would break down their stone wall." So we see the opposition that immediately arises and confronts Nehemiah, first from Sanballat and from Tobiah. But then it goes on, and hop down to verse 7 real quick. "And when Sanballat, Tobiah, and the Arabs, and the Ammonites, and the Ashdodites heard about the repair of the walls of Jerusalem was progressing, and the gaps were being closed, they became furious. And they all plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and throw it into confusion. So we prayed to our God and stationed a guard because of them, day and night." So we see that opposition is sort of laid out. And in this chapter, the 4th chapter of Nehemiah, we go through and we see who the primary characters are. Now, Sanballat, or Sanballat, depending upon how you want to pronounce his name, Sanballat is someone who, in these lists, is always first. Generally, that means he was the chief person, or he was the champion. He was the chief instigator of the opposition that's going on. Now, Sanballat was someone that brought in opposition into Nehemiah, and he came from Samaria, which was to the north of Jerusalem. But then we also run into a couple other people, and we see them there in verse 7. Tobiah and the Arabs, the Ammonites. Now, Tobiah is recognized as an Ammonite, and then we also had the Ashdodites. Now, the Arabs, as we see, come from the south of Jerusalem. And as we're going to see, maybe your translation has Geshem is mentioned in there as well as an actor. But also the Ammonites, who are located to the west of Jerusalem. And then finally, we had the Ashdodites, who are in the east of Jerusalem. So what this leaves us, it's a really interesting list. If we're reading it in that context or in the immediate context, when it was written, we would have recognized something really quick. Guess what? Nehemiah is surrounded. Not only is surrounded, but he's got a guy named Tobiah who's running around on the inside messing with stuff. And all that opposition from the outside where he's surrounded soon begins to permeate into where the Jews themselves begin getting worried. Start worrying about Nehemiah's abilities. When I was reading through this and I realized, hey, wait for a second, the way the author put this around, that he's showing that these people are all surrounding Nehemiah. It reminded me of a story. One of my favorite miniseries that came out was Band of Brothers. Came out a number of years ago. It's the European theater. And this is the story about Easy Company, who was part of the 101st Airborne. And one of the scenes that really stuck to my mind, because sometimes you're reading through the Bible, these kinds of things happen. It just sort of picked up with that, and I said, hey, this is an interesting story. Because Nehemiah was surrounded on all sides, and there's a scene in one of the episodes where Easy Company is getting ready to go into Bastogne and relieve some soldiers that were on the front line, what would become the Battle of the Bulge. And as they are progressing in that area, they're getting ready, they're arming themselves, they're equipping themselves, they're getting supplies. A young lieutenant comes up to Dick Winters, who's a leader of Easy Company and a major figure in these stories, and he goes, Winters, you know that when you go in there, you're going to be surrounded. And without missing a beat, Dick Winters looks at the lieutenant, and he goes, Lieutenant, that's okay. We're paratroopers. We're supposed to be surrounded. A lot of times you're going to encounter opposition because of who you are, where you are, and it's going to feel like you're surrounded, because that's exactly where sometimes the people of God are. Sometimes we find ourselves opposed not because of who we are, but because of what we stand for. And you're going to feel like you're surrounded, and that's okay. Opposition that comes against us doesn't mean inherently that there's something wrong with us or that we're bad people, though we do want to keep a check in our spirit about that. But rather, opposition is often the natural standing point of the people of God, because we are often opposed. We are often find ourselves in the midst of conflict. We find ourselves in the midst of opposition in difficult ways. But we also want to remember then, notice how Nehemiah responds. We want to see how he does this. One of the first points that we see is in confronting Nehemiah, in confronting opposition, Nehemiah exercises wisdom. Nehemiah exercises wisdom. He doesn't let the opposition overcome him, but notice what he does. Look in verse 4 and 5. Listen, our God, this is Nehemiah speaking. For we are despised. Make their insults return on their own heads, and let them be taken as plunder to the land of captivity. Do not cover their guilt, or let their sin be erased from your sight, because they have angered the builders. So we rebuilt the wall until the entire wall was joined together up to half the height, and for the people had the will to keep working. And then kick over to verse 12. When the Jews who had lived nearby arrived, they said to us time and again, everywhere you turn, they will attack us. So I stationed people behind the lowest sections of the wall and the vulnerable areas. I stationed them by families with their swords and spears and bows. And after I made an inspection, I stood up and said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people, don't be afraid of them. Remember the great and awe-inspiring Lord, and fight for your countrymen, your sons and your daughters and your wives. And examples of this go on and on. Nehemiah acts wisely. The first thing that he does is he goes before God and he prays. He seeks out God's face. He's angry. I think 4 and 5, some commentators get a little flustered about verses 4 and 5 because it's kind of Nehemiah calling fire down on these guys' heads. But the reality of the situation is that when you look a little deeper into the text, Nehemiah goes to God and he prays on their behalf. He goes and he tries to figure it out. But it also gives me assurance that sometimes when I'm facing opposition, it's okay to be flustered. It's okay to get frustrated. It's okay to be in a place where I don't completely understand what's going on, and I can go before God and say, God, why is this happening? I thought you put this in my heart. I thought you put this in my vision. I thought you put this in front of me to accomplish this. Because sometimes opposition comes exactly when God has placed something in your heart and in your vision and in front of you, just like with Nehemiah. So the first thing that Nehemiah does is he exercises wisdom. Notice also that he doesn't leave his people. He doesn't retreat. He doesn't go away, but he stays in the midst of them. He hears their complaints. He doesn't immediately address the complaints of Sanballat and Tobiah and the Ashdodites and the Ammonites and the Arabs and all those. He doesn't immediately address their complaints, as foolish as they are. I mean, Tobiah was just being foolish, man. He's just being a jerk. Man, they can't even build the wall the right way. They're going to have a fox run up on top. It's going to knock the whole thing down. You can't even file that report correctly. You don't know what you're doing. I can't believe you would even think it was possible for you to accomplish that and start a business on your own. I can't even imagine that you would think that it's possible that you could do that in this school, in this place, for God's glory. The way that we encounter opposition comes at us, we have to first exercise wisdom. The second thing that Nehemiah does after exercising wisdom is he maintains his character. Nehemiah maintains his character. It would have been easy to sink down to the level of these guys that came against him. One of the constant refrains that we get from great works of literature that deal with opposition is how we don't need to become that thing that opposes us, that we are to stay above it. That's one of the really hard things to do because it's easy to become that thing that opposes us. It's easy to become that sin in this world. It's easy to use evil to return evil, but that's not how we're supposed to operate as Christians. It's not how Nehemiah gives us an example. Look over to Nehemiah 6. This is where the second part of this passage is. So Nehemiah 6, we hear again that Sanballat, Tobiah, Geshem the Arab, and the rest of the enemies, this is in verse 1, had heard that I had rebuilt the wall and there was no gap left in me. So what ultimately happens is they send him a number of notes asking him to go to Ono, or the Ono Valley, where they can meet with him. But Nehemiah figures out this is what's going on. He knows what they're about. He stays with his people. He maintains his character. He doesn't go and use the imperial edict that he's carrying in his pocket to chop off their heads, but rather he allows themselves and these people to let their character work themselves out. Notice what he does. They send the same proposal 4 times, and on the 5th time, Sanballat sent me this same message by his aide, who had an open letter in his hand. Now, hold on for a second. An open letter in his hand is an important phrase, and if you've missed this, you've missed the whole idea about the issue of character. In this day, the way that you tried to give communication or correspondence between officials and between public servants is you would write your letter and then you would seal it so that you had made sure that the only person who would read it first was that civic individual, and you do it with wax and a little stamp. And every leader had a different, or every official had a different stamp. We found a lot of these stamps in archaeology, and it's been pretty neat to see how they've worked. But notice what Sanballat does here. He doesn't put a sealed envelope together, but rather he hands it to a messenger in an open piece of paper. And as he does that, that messenger is going to walk. He's not going to get in his car. He's not going to take it by carrier because God hadn't invented the person that invented the airplane yet. But what happens is that this person walks from Sanballat's place all the way to Nehemiah. And there's not a lot to see when you're walking down that road. And he just happened to maybe open it up and read over what's going on. And he reads, oh man, look what the accusations are, that you're going to become and this is what he wrote. He said, that it is reported among the nations, and Geshem agrees, that the Jews plan to rebel, and you're going to be their king. So here's this messenger who's not in the loop on any of these conversations, doesn't know what's going on, who's walking down the road using a letter that's open to him that he shouldn't be reading, and he encounters other people. Hey, did you hear what the Jews are going to do? They're going to rise up. They're going to rebel. They're going to take this city, and they're going to squash everybody. Nehemiah doesn't respond to that. Nehemiah maintains his character. So as he encounters this opposition, Nehemiah maintains his character. But then also we see that he rests in his hope. We see that Nehemiah rests in his hope. Look in a couple places. Kick back over to chapter 4 real quick. Won't have you moving around too much more. But in chapter 4 and verse 14, and then we're going to go down to 19. When Nehemiah encounters the opposition, particularly from within, notice what he says. After he made the inspection, stood among the officials, he said, "Do not be afraid of them," that is the people that are coming, or possibly coming. "Remember that the great and awe-inspiring Lord, and fight for your countrymen." Then kick down to 19. "And then I said to the nobles and the officials and the rest of the people, the work is enormous and spread out, and we are separated far from one another all along the wall. Whenever you hear the trumpet sound, rally to us. Our God will fight for us." Nehemiah rested in his hope. He rested, and you see in both of those verses, then also we'll find a place, if you want to read through it later, in chapter 6, where Nehemiah rests in the promise that God is for him. When you encounter opposition in your life, can you rest in the fact that God is for you? Can you rest in the fact that God has a plan, that He's put a purpose in your heart, that He's put a great thing in you for you to accomplish? And that opposition's natural when these kinds of things happen. Nehemiah rests in his hope. These three ways that Nehemiah acts are pretty amazing ways, things that he does. They're different, they're otherworldly. So what lessons can we take from this? What lesson can we, as people who are called by Jesus' name, take from this? Well, when we really break it down, we see one major truth that we see in Nehemiah, but is exampled in our lives. And the reality is that our Jesus-changed lives show others a better way. That as we encounter opposition, our Jesus-changed lives show others a better way. Using the characteristics that Nehemiah exampled, then we get to apply that through the covenant calling that we have in Jesus Christ. The character and the identity that we have in Jesus Christ. That our Jesus-changed lives show others a better way. We don't return evil for evil. We don't return bitterness for bitterness. We have a different agenda. One of the passages that sticks out to me about how we see this worked out is from Peter, who's an apostle, who was writing to the earliest Christians, really in that first generation. To be a Christian in the first decade or so was really difficult. And it got even more difficult as they went along. But the Christians of this era thought that they were the next step beyond Judaism. They thought they were the fulfillment of the messianic promises because we believe that Jesus is that fulfillment. So as they went into where they were, they would go into the temple and worship. They would try to still be a part of their families, but they're following after this guy, this Messiah, the followers. They weren't called Christians initially. They were called followers of the way. They're following after this way, but the way had costs. It severed relationships. It severed families. It probably cost them jobs and economic resources. And then came the other opposition, the persecution, the physical persecution. Peter writes to a group of Christians who are undergoing this physical persecution, and as he's writing to them, he doesn't tell them to follow the ways of the world, but rather he gives them a different orientation on how they handle their opposition. And I'll pick it up. I'll have it up here on the screens, but it's going to be in 1 Peter chapter 3. It's an amazing passage of Scripture. And it's going to be 3, 8 through 16, but again, I'll have it up here. Now, finally, all of you should be like-minded and sympathetic, should love believers, and be compassionate and humble, not paying back evil for evil or insult for insult, but on the contrary, giving a blessing since you are called for this, so that you can inherit a blessing. For the one who wants to love life and to see good days must keep his tongue from evil and his lips from speaking deceit. And he must turn away from evil and do what is good. He must seek peace and pursue it. Because the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous and his ears are open to their request. But the face of the Lord is against those who do what is evil. And who will harm you if you are deeply committed to what is good? But even if you should suffer for righteousness, you are blessed. Do not fear what they fear or be disturbed, but honor the Messiah as Lord in your hearts. Always be ready to give a defense for anyone who asks for a reason for the hope that is within you. However, do this with gentleness and with respect, keeping your conscience clear, so that when you are accused, those who denounce your Christian life will be put to shame. Sometimes we encounter opposition, and our natural reaction is to hit back. Sometimes when we encounter opposition, our natural reaction is to send the strongly worded email or to demonstrate in a meeting how your rank and position overpowers the person who has brought opposition in an inappropriate way. Or maybe it's more personal. Maybe it's in your family. Maybe it's in something that you're trying to do. Maybe it's in everyday life. What's curious about this is these are Christians who, as they met in their assembly, would have looked across the room. It wouldn't have been anything like this, but they would have looked across the room and they would have seen scars from persecutions past and wounds from persecutions present displayed around them. And that makes us angry, and that makes us frustrated. But Peter doesn't say, go out and get a stick and hit them back. Peter doesn't say, go back and retaliate. Peter doesn't tell them to return their evil with evil. He doesn't tell them to run and hide either. He doesn't tell them to hold back their assistance from those that are in need because other people are hurting them. But rather, he reminds them, however you do this with gentleness and respect, keep your conscience clear. You know, the great thing about this passage here is that this passage is often used for how we go about defending the Christian faith. Now, this is the whole 1 Peter 3:15, be ready to give a defense, and apologia is in the Greek. The ready to give a defense for that hope that is within you. Well, the earliest Christians, the way that they got the ability to give the defense wasn't because of their position in society, it was because of what they had done for those that were least among them. The reason that they had the ability to give a rational defense to be people that would oppose them. I mean, imagine that. There's a Roman soldier beating down on you, and they hold the whip for 1 second and say, and why do you follow Jesus? Because sometime your opposition that you've encountered will be the reason you get to tell somebody about the faith that you hold. That's a powerful reality that we often lose because we're not supposed to hit back. We're not supposed to hit them before they hit us, but rather that we go to the places and be the people that we're supposed to be. Opposition's going to come. How are we going to handle it? Can you be graceful? Can you exercise wisdom? Can you maintain your character? Are you going to be able to see hope? So, ultimately, we have to ask the question, so what? So what about all this? This is great. Nehemiah was a great example. 1 Peter gives us a challenge. What are some practical things that we can do? So what do we do about this? Well, how do we respond to opposition? One of the first things I recommend is asking one question. Are you actually wrong? This might be a novel question for some of us. I know it's often one for me. That I recognize, am I wrong? Are you wrong? Are we wrong on this? Did we read the wrong article? Did we get the wrong input? Did I try to be junior Holy Spirit for somebody who actually needed to hear from the actual Holy Spirit? Do I have a whole set of presuppositions about the situation that don't match reality? Is my agenda not God-driven, Holy Spirit inspired? Am I wrong? There's a story out there that I was reading, and there was a bunch of prisoners that were really angry at their prison. They had really bad conditions. Things weren't going great for them, and so they conspired. They got together, and they escaped from prison. They got caught because they weren't very smart, but they got caught, and they got dragged back to the warden's office. And the warden's asking them, why did you guys leave? You shouldn't have left this prison. You're going to be in here even longer than you were going to be here. They started talking about the conditions, about the food, about the environment. And like a normal thing, they begin the process. After hearing their complaints, they said, well, that doesn't really matter. We're going to keep doing what we're going to do. Now, tell us how you escaped. And one of the prisoners looked at him and said, we used toast from this morning. Sometimes you can be wrong in where you're at. Sometimes the conditions can actually be very bad. How you respond to opposition begins with that first question. Second thing is remember this, that hurting people hurt people. Hurting people hurt people. There's a place where we get to where we recognize this. I remember I was serving with a pastor a couple years ago, and he told us the story in staff meeting one time. He had been out and he was preaching on some specific thing, and he said some line that he held to. This guy got really angry about it, and he wrote him this 3-page, just a just a firefighting letter that he was just he called heaven down on this guy, and this guy that I was working with, and he just told him what he thought about him. And it was mean. And the preacher, this pastor got this email, or he got this letter, and he looked at it, and he read it, and he was like, man, that's really mean. And he put it off to the side. And he didn't respond right away. And he was going to get around to it. He let himself cool down because he recognized that hurting people hurt people. Now, one of the things that happened was he got a little confused. He got a little waylaid, and the letter got shuffled into some papers and got filed in a cabinet somewhere. But a couple months later, he was speaking at a conference, and this guy comes up to him and says, hey, about 6 or 9 months ago, I came and I sent a letter to you because I was really angry at you. And it was a mean letter, and I said some really mean things. But I was struggling with some stuff in my life. I had some sin that I was struggling with. I was dealing with some things personally. And you never responded to me with an equally bad response. And that really helped me. It made me figure out that there was something wrong with me. And the pastor said this to say this to us as a staff. He said, don't ever forget that hurting people can hurt people. That hurting people can hurt people. Because the way some people lash out is because they themselves have something going on. Which also reminds us that we need to consider how public our response needs to be. Consider how public your response needs to be. Social media is a lot of interesting things. And it's probably not the best thing to, when somebody opposes you privately or maybe even publicly, hop on Facebook and let people know what you think, or use InstaChat or Snapagram and let them know what's going on, because it's pretty easy to blow things up out of proportion. Now, I know for some of you that use Facebook, you never do this, and it's all the other people I follow. But it's amazing how we can take a private hurt and make it a public issue and ultimately exacerbate the situation. Consider how public your response needs to be. Nehemiah's example reminds us that he had to respond publicly because the challenges that he was seeing were working themselves out into the Jewish people that were working with him. But there are other things that he was careful with. A fourth thing, also consider about leading with grace. Lead with grace. Anticipate that person might have a point. Lead with grace. Anticipate that person is a valid representation of an argument. Anticipate that opposition that you're receiving is someone who needs the love of Christ. Lead with grace. And then fifth, pray unceasingly. Pray unceasingly. There was another pastor that when I was going through college that came and talked to us, and he was talking about a situation that he encountered in his ministry, and he said, and this guy's name was Dr. Mitchell, and he said, whereas one time it was a really tough meeting. It was a tough leader meeting, and at the end, this lady took me and accosted me off to the side and just let me have it, told me everything that she thought about me. And I stopped her and I said, will you pray for me right now? Prayer can change things. We believe that prayer changes things here at University Baptist Church. Can you pray for the people that are opposing you? Pray for them unceasingly. Pray for where they are. Try to figure out what's going on. Nehemiah goes and he prays, and he sees an amazing thing happen. So pray unceasingly. And then finally, never underestimate the power of personal touch. Never underestimate the power of personal touch. It's really easy to grab your phone and text people and email them. The problem with that is that your vocal intonation doesn't always follow. And some of us are really bad at how we communicate via text or via email by not being able to communicate well. Sometimes reaching out to somebody with a personal touch, going to their office, sitting down with them, maybe grabbing lunch together, getting coffee, talking through all this stuff is a necessary step because we can forget that there are people on the other end. Never underestimate the power of personal touch. So through all of these, we're led to the final, sort of our big idea for today. That just like Nehemiah, we can confront opposition with wisdom, character, and hope. And this shows others our Jesus-changed lives. Just like Nehemiah, we can confront opposition with wisdom, character, hope, and this shows others our Jesus-changed lives. In the Fountainhead, we are left with, at the end of the book, and kind of if you want to read it, feel free. I'm going to kind of let you know a little bit of what happens. Howard Rourke overcomes his opposition by ultimately using his own ego and cunning. He overcomes them and he triumphs over them by beating them down. He overcomes them by doing some terrible acts that the author believes shows how he was a true champion over people. His example doesn't work for us, other than to show us that we shouldn't become the opposition that's opposed to us. Don't become that thing, but rather let us take that place and be people who use wisdom, who use character, and who use hope. And just like Nehemiah, show people how we can have life that's changed in Jesus Christ. When you encounter opposition, see it as an opportunity to show people Christ, talk to them about that hope, and show them your changed life.